a group of former senior military figures have warned that recognising Palestine will jeopardise UK defence and intelligence. They've joined the former Defence Secretary Sir Grant Shapps in writing a joint letter to The Times to express their concerns. They say Israeli intelligence has helped thwart terror attacks in the UK, and Israeli military hardware helps the British Army, but all of that is now at risk. Of course, we're set to hear from Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper later. She's going to make her formal declaration to the United Nations that the UK is recognising the state of Palestine. Other nations are following suit. Let's speak to one of the signatories now, Dr Chris Parry, a retired Rear Admiral in the Royal Navy and a former NATO commander. Chris, good evening to you.
Hello, Kate.
I suppose many people might cheekily say, well, this is a bit late, Chris. We've been talking about this for quite some time. You put forward a good argument in your letter to The Times. What effect do you think it might provoke, or is it, just simply food for thought?
Well, no, it's an expression of disgust, really, Kate. I mean, we've been saying on social media and in several documents up till now that this is a really bad idea. It's right up there, I'm afraid, with the Chagos a strategic decision as well. And we're really worried that the government doesn't think through what the consequences are of some of these decisions. And you've seen already today that Hamas has celebrated the fact that the United Kingdom and others have said, we're recognising Palestine. Our worries really centre on the fact that we have a really close relationship, or we have had a really close relationship with Israel, mainly in terms of very, very special intelligence. But also, of course, the country has some of the most advanced anti-missile systems in the world. And right now we're facing a threat from Russia and other countries. And frankly, the United Kingdom is wide open to missile attack, ballistic, hypersonic and cruise missiles. We have absolutely next to nothing to defend ourselves. And we've just alienated the country that probably has the best air defence shield in the world.
OK. Set out your other arguments for our listeners, Chris, if you can. You've talked about the air defence shield. What else does Israel do for the UK in partnership that it would be very difficult for us to get from elsewhere?
Well, Kate, I think really right at the top is the very, very good intelligence that they provide. I mean, the cynic would say, well, they didn't actually provide much intelligence ahead of 7th of October, but they were distracted, of course, by the Abraham Accords and the threat from Iran at the time. But by and large, the sort of intelligence we get on threats that are both in the UK and threats to the UK that come from Israel are very high grade indeed and irreplaceable. But the very fact that the government hasn't actually sought to get any advantage whatsoever, not even the release of the hostages or any compensating military or strategic advantage in this, it's just something I've never seen in my career. As I said, it's right up there with the Chagos, I would say the Chagos scam, because I think it is. And, I just don't understand who's making the strategic decisions in our country right now, such that the harms downstream are going to be very big indeed.
I suppose, look, people are going to say to you, to counteract that, what can the UK government do to signal their discontent with the military operation and the government's, the Israeli government's perspective, I suppose, on Gaza? How can the UK take a stand? I think we can all understand that the situation in Gaza is intolerable. Lives are being lost unnecessarily, and it's gone on for too long. So how can the government react, I suppose, without putting any kind of partnership with Israel under threat?
Kate, whenever this discussion comes up, I say if we had been undertaking the war in Gaza, we could not have avoided the level of civilian casualties that the Israelis have incurred. On the other side, they are trying to obviously reduce the number of casualties, but you've got an opponent that insists on putting its own population out in front to make sure they're human shields. And frankly, as I said, I don't think any country could have conducted this war with less casualties on the other side. Now, the other issue is, I always say to members of the government who say exactly what you've just said, which is pretty reasonable, what's your solution then? how is Israel going to deal with Hamas, ensure that it's not going to be attacked again, and get over the massive national trauma that occurred on the 7th of October 2023? Because I think people underestimate how traumatic that was for the Israelis. And any policy they put in place with regard to dealing with Hamas or anybody else is affected by that trauma. The question, Kate, frankly, is, what would you do? What would anybody do other than what the Israelis are doing in trying to eliminate
and look,
this threat?
This is really difficult territory, Chris, because you're effectively endorsing the work of the Israeli Defense Forces and the Israeli government, which nations around the world have condemned. You're absolutely right. Trying to find a way through that puzzle is incredibly difficult, particularly when there are Israeli citizens still being held hostage in Gaza. The recognition of a Palestinian state, it has been floating around for decades. We know that it was part of the manifesto of Labour as well. And they did set conditions in place. I suppose they would argue back to you, well, we said to Israel, look, unless you meet these conditions, this is something we will do. I suppose the fact is there are now more developed nations who back this move than don't back this move. Are you concerned that this is a political move by this government, Chris, that Keir Starmer's done this to appease some of the dissenting voices in his own party, to maybe garner some popularity with those people in the UK who might be Labour voters and want to see some action on Palestine, on Gaza?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'm afraid the suspicion has to be there. But I think, one way of looking at this is saying, look, when we were facing down Hitler in 1940 on our own, it's rather like the Americans saying, you know what? We're not going to give you any aid, and we are going to recognize Nazi Germany because it's got legitimate concerns, and frankly, it's not our war. We'll stay out of it. That's what we're doing. We're actually saying to an ally who has an existential crisis right now. And let's not forget, Israel was fighting on 7 fronts until about 6 weeks ago. We're saying, well, actually, we're cutting you loose. We're going to legitimize everything that the Palestinians, including Hamas, have done. And how do you feel about that? And you're right. There must be a measure of appeasing the Islamic vote in the United Kingdom at the expense of the Jewish vote. And I'm afraid it's a question of numbers. We know there's only 270,000 Jewish people in Britain. There's many more Muslims, and most of them, of course, vote Labour. And even if that's not true, there must be a suspicion that there is a political angle to this. There's also an ideological one as well, because, as you hinted, it's always been the agenda of Labour to recognise Palestine, come what may. But if you and I look for Palestine on a map right now, you'd be pushed to know what that means.
Yeah. Well, that is part of the issue, of course, in this. But they feel, something needs to be done to stop the West Bank being annexed even further by Israel. Look, there'll be a lot of people who don't agree with your point of view, but thinking about it from a national security,
I've never cared, Kate.
Thinking about it from a national security angle is food for thought. And obviously, you and your colleagues felt driven to write to the Times to make this point, as you said, you've been making for several months now. It's good to speak to you, Chris. Thank you. This is that is Dr Chris Parry there, who is a Rear Admiral Dr Chris Parry, former NATO commander.